Well, hello again, and welcome to our latest coffee catch-up, where, as you know, we've been exploring the organisational implications of COVID-19. The last set of coffee catch-ups were all about how to lead within a lockdown situation. But now, as with everybody else, the focus is moving on to how you move out of lockdown, but into an uncertain future. So what we're going to do is look at three areas that can help you build a more resilient organisation. But first, before that, let's do some quick introductions. My name's Gary Ashton. I'm a partner at OECAM.
I'm Julie Brophy. I'm a principal consultant at OECAM, business psychologist.
And I'm Maria Mirza, and I'm a business psychologist at OECAM.
Great. So let's look at what we're going to cover off this morning. And the slide isn't changing. So whilst we're doing that, I'll just quickly tell you the order of the day. We'll first be looking at the drivers for change in terms of what the organisation needs to do going forward. Then we'll look at a definition of organisational resilience. And then we'll cover off three aspects of organisational resilience. About reimagining your organisation, about redeveloping social cohesion, and about adapting to new behaviours. That's great, Julie.
Okay, good.
So those are the areas we're going to be covering, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end of the session. But first, a question for you all in the chat box. And the question is, what are the drivers now for change that you're seeing in your organisations as you come out of lockdown? So this is about, in order to now rebuild your organisation, what are the influences that are pushing you now to start to reconsider how you organise yourself in the business and how you organise your business? So if you just put that into the chat box, then we'll see see what the range of responses are from your perspective. So anything, I mean, this could be, for example, a sudden drive on the need to go more digital, faster than you thought. Could be about the need to take costs out of the business. What are the drivers that you're seeing in your organisation?
So we've got some coming in here, Gary. So we've got Kevin, who's talking about managing the conflict between short-term survival and long-term strategy. Mm-hmm. We've got Louise, who's talking about channel changes, employee needs, health and safety. I think that's something that a lot of people are looking at the moment, the health and safety aspect. Demand volatility from Steve. Louise is also talking about global differences of the pandemic and how that's affecting organisations that obviously have a global footprint. From Danny, we've got a comment about need to be more agile when we interact with our customers.
Yeah.
Costs, differing skills and capabilities, and cost base being too big. So that's some of the examples of the chat that's coming through.
Great. Yes. No, thank you for that. Yeah, so we'll be covering off some of those issues as we go through this session today, actually. So I think what would be good is to see the areas that we've seen some of our clients looking at, which deals with some of the things you've said. One is, of course, the absolute spending power of the customer has radically reduced in most sectors, not all, of course. But not only that, customers are changing their priorities, so that need to be more agile and respond to the change in the reduction and the change in their needs is required. The other point about, because of the social distancing requirements on how you manage employee interactions and customer interactions with the customer. So you're having to look at new ways in which you are interacting. Obviously, the cost base is writ large, and we heard from Airbus this morning as yet another organisation taking big costs out of their organisation. But another one that we're seeing is, and this is probably more of an opportunistic driver rather than a push driver, which is organisations are seeing the acceleration of the delivery of some of their goals, long-term goals. I mean, as some have said, that some of their long-term goals were delivered in five weeks, and there is an opportunity to deliver more within 2020 because everything is in flux, notwithstanding all the issues that you've been saying. But as one of you mentioned, Kevin, the short-term and long-term goal, it's how do you bring those two together? And I think this moment of opportunity, as the Churchillian question, quote, "Don't waste a good crisis," comes in, is how can you make the most of this? So looking at, first of all, what is organisational resilience? Because I think if we use that as our guiding light, then it makes sure that we answer the right questions as to what to do going forward. So this is one quote showing that it's the ability of an organisation to anticipate, prepare for, respond and adapt to incremental change and sudden disruptions in order to survive and prosper. So pretty common sense, but it's good to see those words in front of you because it is about how do you have the monitoring systems in your organisation, how you then are able to respond to what you're hearing, and that's for incremental and big sudden disruptions like we've seen in the last few weeks. Now, what in OECAM, we believe there are 4 areas that build organisational resilience. We're just going to cover off some aspects of these, but if we just look at the big picture first, the first being organisation. So that's about how you construct your organisation to be, as we'll go through, low cost, but able to respond to changing market needs. The leaders also need a particular style and an approach to manage people through what's going to be a more bumpy, uncertain ride through the future. All of this then requires you to maintain social cohesion with your employees and with your customers and other partners. And finally, all of those may require you to change behaviours, and that may come up with resistance with the culture of your organisation. So I think if you think of those 4 big buckets, what we're going to do is focus on just some aspects within 3 of those: the organisation, social cohesion, and culture. So the first one we're going to look at is organisation and the reimagined organisation. Now, what you will all have been going through recently is resetting the organisation. And that is about adjusting for home working, the downsizing of your workforce, outsourcing activities, getting rid of management layers, reducing the office space that you have, and therefore reducing property costs. So all of that, everyone's doing writ large. And what you'll be doing over these summer months is remobilising, where you are taking people through the change curve of them adapting to this new world, dealing with survivor syndrome, with people who are going to remain in your organisation, but knowing that a number of their colleagues may not be with them anymore. Building new capabilities, building new interfaces between a restructured organisation, and therefore making sure that you maintain the social cohesion of your organisation and change behaviours. But all of that, you are running the risk of restricting the opportunity, because this is responding to a big shock to your organisations. And what we're finding with a few of our clients now, not all, is the fact that they are able now to say, well, we are doing that, but we need to do something else as well. And that's about reimagining what your organization could be. And it's about looking at the future, looking at what your original strategic goals were. They may well have adjusted, but how can you now relook at how you organize yourself to make sure that you are resilient to respond, but you can make a leap forward. Now, often the ways in which people look at organizations can make them feel restricted because they're used to looking at the standard organograms of the organization, and it kind of narrows and restricts their thinking. So one way we find useful for businesses to look at their organization is from the value chain perspective. And this is about really being clear about what are the value added steps that you as a business need to excel at in order to deliver your proposition. And once you've defined those, and here on this screen, it's a fairly simplified version of it. Organizations have more complex versions than this, but you can then start to map your current organization on this and then start to say, well, are there other ways of doing it? So here, fairly obviously, we've got a functional organization where each of the value added steps is covered by a particular function, supported by the corporate services of HR, finance, and IT. Of course, you could have a market oriented organization where you are clustering around particular markets, and that applies, as someone said, different markets around the world are managing the impact of COVID in different ways and are at different times as well. But what you then need to do is really, as well as this drive for reducing cost, which I think, as well as the absolute taking headcount out, will mean an increase in a push for going for functional scale. I think the organizations are really trying to get unified ways of doing things along particular functions. And that's all well and good. But what I think you need to have as a checkpoint is to maintain the power and authority of the customer voice in your organization. And that's making sure that you have enough power and influence in the organization that says, no, your customer is saying this, we need to adapt in that way. Now, of course, there's a trade-off here, because the more you go to customer focus, which means you're close to the customer and you can be responsive to customer needs, that's a good thing. However, what you're probably being pushed for at the moment is efficiency and common ways of doing things in order to save money. But of course, you need both, and it's getting the balance between that, because there are downsides to each. So the customer focus could mean duplication, as we saw in that previous example of markets. You could duplicate ways of doing things across different markets, and there could be rivalries between them. However, there is a downside to functional scale as well. So you may get the cost savings, but you will be slower. You could well be slower to respond to the marketplace. And actually, you may end up having a one size fits nobody, and that's no good for anybody. So what you can play with then is saying, well, how do you get that balance? And the balance will be different for every organization. So here I've shown that market D needs its fully integrated functions and is managed independently, whereas others may be able to share some functions like fulfillment, product management, and supply management. But the piece that I want to raise here is the shift in power of the product management or service management, it may be in your organization, is to who has, and if you think about it in your own organization, who has the insight, who gets the insight, who then defines what the value proposition is, and who says what needs to change in your organization to make yourselves adapt to what's happening in the marketplace, because you're going to need that in a very powerful way over the next 2 or 3 years for sure. But you also need, of course, to get this functional excellence. So in some areas, let's say in this example, fulfillment, sure, maybe you'd be able to create a single fulfillment unit that creates efficiencies there. But you may want to build in the authority and capability of the product management stream. Any change that you do has an effect on interfaces, and therefore you then need to work at contracting or recontracting between functions to make sure that they work correctly. And all of this may require new capabilities. So I think the one that's actually being pushed for harder now is, of course, people are going digital even faster now, and data, although this has been on the cards for the last few years, I think everyone's seeing the need to be able to analyze your data of what your customer is wanting and buying, and then turning it into insight has become more important, and that would fit within that product management and the market management space. And all of this, when you reimagine your organization, may well mean that you need to change to new behaviors, or you need to change behaviors, and that we'll address later on. So this as a tool is one that we would advocate, that first define what are the value-added steps of your organization, really think through what does your customer need from you and what does your customer want from you, and then start to play with your organizational opportunities. And that really is about getting the balance of customer focus with functional scale. As I say, to avoid yourself becoming too restricted by your cost reduction, making sure that you've got someone with a strong voice that can make you adapt and change to be that resilient organization. And then when you've got that framework, really then think about what colleagues require to excel within that type of organization. And of course, your partners as well, your suppliers and your stakeholders, because you need to interact with them and they need to understand how to interact with you. So use this framework as a way of thinking through all of your organization and making sure that you get that balance right. So that's the first area on organization. Now, of course, if you do start to disrupt yourself in those particular ways, that may mean you've deconstructed and reconstructed teams. And that might mean that you've got the risk of people not being as connected as they used to before. Julie, do you want to take up the reins from here?
Thanks, Gary. So as Gary said, if we've built an organisation that is resilient and able to respond to changes in market, we're also going to need to have teams within those organisations and relationships with our customers and our partners that are equally able to adapt to the changes. So I'm going to talk about one particular area about social cohesion. I'm going to start by just defining what social cohesion is, and I'm going to ask you about what you've been doing in your organisations to look at social cohesion, but then I'm going to look at a specific area, which is about in-groups and out-groups. So we'll start by defining this. I mean, social cohesion refers to the extent of connectedness and solidarity within groups in an organisation. And I think really talking to people over lockdown, they've said, oh, we've never felt so connected as a team. We spend a lot of time communicating with each other and connecting and making sure that we're aware of what everyone else is doing. I think what I've been hearing less of is how those teams have been connecting with other teams. So teams have become less porous. You've got less opportunity to have those little side conversations with other people in other teams that happen when you're actually co-located. And then some of it is actually about the solidarity of the group, because it's not just about being connected, but it's about having that sense of belonging to a team. And that relationship between those members. And I think that's been much easier for people who know each other to keep those relationships going during lockdown. But for people who are either new to a team, or actually I know a few people have started a new job in lockdown, getting that relationship and that sense of belonging has actually been harder for them. So really my question for you, just sort of in the chat, is to say, what have you or your organisation been doing to maintain social cohesion during lockdown for any of these groups? So within your team, between your teams, and as Gary said, it's key to have those relationships with customers and external suppliers and partners. So what kind of things have you been doing in your organisation to maintain that social cohesion? So if you just write your answers into the chat box. And just while you're doing that, I've had a couple of questions about, will we share the slides? Yes, we will be sending out the presentation slides after the webinar. So I think coffee mornings is coming out, or coffee meetings is something that's been coming out quite a lot. What other examples have you got? Informal catch-ups. So Steve been saying formal catch-ups with no specific purpose. Yeah, that's a really good one for social cohesion. It's about those relationships. I think one of the interesting things has been how you can do that on video, because video is much more open. So if I wanted to make a comment to Gary about our relationship, that would be a little more open. So you might have to have more side conversations or side meetings. Mixing directorates, yep, so that's across the teams. That's good. That's making the team more porous. Global recognition tools, yep, clap for the collective nominations, please. Thank you for that. Quizzes, yep. WhatsApp group, encouraged to join external sessions and share learning. Yep, I think that's absolutely key. As I say, teams are very connected, but how porous are they? Yammer. Yammer has been a lifeline, Danny's saying here. So yeah, so having those little conversations, not only with the bigger group, but with the smaller group. Okay, so those are the kind of things that people have been doing. Interestingly, it's kind of what we've been doing with customers and external suppliers as well, how much have we been able to contact them because of their situation, and what are we going to be doing about that when we come out of lockdown? The reason I wanted to look at in-groups and out-groups is there's an issue that's really been starting to be talked about, and that's about furloughed staff and how do they come back, and also how do we then socially distance our teams. So I wanted to start with furloughed staff, because talking to a couple of clients that we have, they've been talking about how can they recognise people that have been working in the office or they've been working from home the whole time and haven't been furloughed, and how can they make some kind of recognition of their efforts. And then the conversation started about, well, how does that balance with the people who have been furloughed? And they didn't choose to be furloughed, but they have not been able to work for the organisation. They probably haven't been as connected. Organisations really spent as much time talking to furloughed people as they could, so they might feel a bit isolated. And how do you bring those two teams together? Because I think that's going to be a very interesting thing. Some of the language that was being used when I was talking to a client, they were actually talking about, well, these guys have been on holiday for 12 weeks and I've been working the whole time, which is one way of looking at it. But from their perspective, it may be, I haven't been connected to my team, or I haven't had as much interaction as other people. So they're having a different experience of it. And I think one of the key things is when you bring these two teams back together is not to ignore it. There's going to be an elephant in the room about those people that were on furlough and those weren't. So I think addressing that is going to be really key for organisations. Some organisations we've heard of talking about bringing part of the team back on a rotation basis. So they might spend a week working in the office, then the office will be deep cleaned, and then another part of the team will come in and work in the office. And the difficulty you may have with that is that those teams that are working in the office become their own team. They become an in-group. And what you don't want is for those little internal silos to become very important. And the kind of factors that affect group cohesion are similarity. So that can be with your internal team or your external team, or with your partners and your customers. And if you are working on a similar project, that gives you some sense of similarity. It's the things you need to become a team are very small. I mean, there's research by a guy called Henry Treffel, who actually managed to get team affiliation just based on the colour of a T-shirt. So you can see that it's very small. So actually being the team that works on week 1 or the team that works on team 2 would be enough for them to form their own in-group. Group size. So again, it's going to be easier for those small subgroups to become teams rather than the whole group. But having common goals and objectives, group successes and external competition, those are all the kind of factors that help develop in-groups. So obviously those have upsides and downsides, as Gary was talking about advantages and disadvantages earlier. So in terms of being a resilient organisation, having a group of team members who can bond very quickly and work effectively together is actually a huge advantage to that resilience. But if we look at the downsides, one of the things we know about in-groups is that they do form unconscious bias about the out-groups. And that example of the people who were furloughed and weren't furloughed is if you have a view that everyone who's on furlough just basically had a 12-week holiday, that is going to be unconscious bias. And it's going to start you thinking about, well, you know, they're a bit, potentially you might think about what have they been doing, or what did they do? As I was working really hard, so I'm actually more dedicated to the organisation than they are. On the other side, the people who were furloughed might be thinking, actually, I'm less secure than those people. What was the decision about making me furloughed? So there's a lot of unconscious bias that could be in those two groups as they come back together. And it does actually, we know, make that work across those team boundaries more effective if we've got these unconscious bias. So what can we do about it? So what are some tips to mitigate the creation of these in-groups and out-groups? Certainly, I think it's continue to have full team meetings. So if you are having part of your team in the office and part of the team out of the office, make sure there are lots of full team meetings and recognise the whole team success. So don't actually look at the group in the office that week or the group in the office that week. It needs to be whole team success. And to make sure that those groups are porous is to invite other members of other teams or customers, suppliers, partners to actually come in. Another thing will be to allocate work across the whole team. So although team A may be in the office one week, the work that they're doing actually cuts across people who are not working in the office at that time. And I've just fallen into the trap of doing this, but avoid labelling the smaller teams, because that will actually give them an identity. And if possible, rotate the membership of those teams. So it's not always the same group of people who are going in on that week, because that will actually break down some of those barriers between the internal silos. Okay. And all of this, as Gary said earlier, and if we're talking about the way that people are interacting together in teams, might actually require them to display new behaviours. So I'm going to hand over to Mariam now to talk you through that.
Yes. So as Gary and Julie mentioned, a part of building resilient organisations is finding new ways of working, which means adopting new behaviours. So I have a question for you, and it's thinking about after this lockdown, post-COVID, what behaviours do you anticipate need to be changed in your organisation? If you want to put your comments and answers in the chat box, that'd be great. Just put those as and when.
Yeah. So Mike's talking about greater responsibility of individuals to do the right thing. Linda's talking about being more open on flexible working. Mm-hmm. Danny's talking about self-directed, autonomous. Philip, focus on groups, not on performance. So Danny's talking about not behaviour, but behaviours towards mindset.
Yeah.
And Janice has been talking about intrusion when concentrating. Yeah, I imagine if people being at home, they've actually not had that intrusion. So how do we go back to being a socially cohesion group, but not interfering with other people? Thanks for those.
Yeah, thank you. A few others that have been talked about are looking at health and safety behaviours, better collaboration, and even looking about balancing online presence with physical presence as well. So yeah, thank you for those. So now that we have a better understanding of what types of behaviours we're looking for, it's then about understanding the how. How do we go about embedding those behaviours? Now, naturally, humans are creatures of habit. So what we can do is use this habit loop to set new habits. And in adopting new behaviours, it's useful to break down behaviours into 3 key areas. And personally, I like to start right at the end, which is the reward. So firstly, I like to look at what is the goal? What do we want to achieve? What is the objective? Is it to travel less? Is it to reduce costs? Is it to collaborate more across silos? Then I can look at the routine. And this is the action itself. What is it that you want your colleagues or your employers to do, or your employees to do? What do you want them to actually act out? How do you want them to behave? And then it's looking at the cue. And I really like the cue because this is the trigger that triggers your decision-making architecture to influence you to make the right decision, or the new decision, or the new behaviour. Now, you might also know the cue as a nudge. And nudges for me are really interesting because you can get really creative with it. So a nudge is can be defined as using the way we behave to influence the decisions we make without taking away our freedom of choice. Now, a really good example of this is thinking about healthy eating. So picture yourself in a lunch canteen and you're at the queue and you're picking out your food. Now, to encourage healthy eating, it wouldn't be to ban junk food. What you could do is nudge yourself into picking more healthier fruits and options. So you would have the apple at eye level, and that nudges you to pick the apple rather than have the plate of chips and gravy that is being served in the lunch canteen. So that is an idea of a nudge. And nudges are essentially prods and prompts. And the reason they're beneficial is because as humans, we don't actually make conscious, logical, rational decisions. Our decision making can be quite spontaneous, instinctive, and unconscious. So nudges allow you to keep prodding yourself to make the right decision and behave in the new and the right way for your context. Now, in order to make a nudge stick, you have to follow the principle of a feast. So a nudge has to be very feasty. So first of all, it has to be fun. It has to be engaging and creative. It then has to be easy. So naturally, we're turned off by complexity and anything complicated. So keeping it as simple as possible is really key. Then it has to be attractive. It has to be relevant for the organization and easily implementable in the context of your organization. It can also be social. So really making use of social mechanisms in the workplace. You know, we often find ourselves working with others. We learn from others, social learning theory. And there was a great study done recently about mask wearing during COVID-19. And they found that when individuals were told that wearing a mask would save the lives of their loved ones and others over themselves, they were more likely to wear a face mask. So using social mechanisms to encourage learning is really key. And then it has to be timely. The timing has to be relevant. So in addition to nudging, there are some great nudging examples that are already in our day-to-day. So you might have seen the footprints outside supermarkets. There's 2 meter distance footprints to indicate social distancing. Come 4th of July, that will be 1 meter plus. So look out for those. So you'll see those out and about. Then we have workplace-based nudges. So this is a really good example that was done with a business who wanted to look at breaking down silos. And what they did is they used a survey to nudge people to be more collaborative across silos. And they asked 2 questions. And these 2 questions were, someone in my organization has asked for my help. And then someone in my organization, I have helped them when they've asked for it. So every quarter they were assessed on these 2 questions and they rated each other. And then they were able to see their own ratings. And they found that after 8 quarters, favorable answers went from 70% to 90%. So the whole notion of having yourself being rated, that you know you're going to be rated by someone else, and you'll be able to see those ratings, had nudged them into collaborating more across different departments and different sections. And then a third example I'd like to talk you through is the one that Boston Consultant Group actually incorporated as part of their policy. And this was looking at work-life balance. And what they did is when sending emails that were outside of work office hours, you would get a notification that came up to say, you are sending an email that is outside Gary Ashton's working hours. How do you want to proceed? A, send the email. B, defer it for the next morning. Or C, cancel the email. And that's essentially a nudge for you to think, how important is this email? And also think about the other person's work-life balance. And this example actually helped improve people's perception of work-life balance in the company as well. So these are some really good examples of how you can use nudging in the workplace and actually see effects. Now, in addition to nudging, you might also want to think about, when embedding behaviours, what are the blockers and the obstacles that are in place that block desired behaviour? And these can be known as sludges. Now, sludges are, by definition, the burdens that separate people from where they want to go and what they want to do. They can often be inconveniences and stop people from making decisions in their best interest. Now, some great examples of sludges that you'll probably be aware of are organisation processes, organisation systems, even administrative burdens. So it is really key, in addition to looking at the reward, the routine, and the cue and those nudges, to identify those sludges as well. What are the things that are holding someone back from acting a certain way and doing the right behaviour? Just a quick question for you, actually. What would you consider to be your sludges in your organisation? You want to pop some of your comments and thoughts in the chat? And I wonder whether we all have similar ones.
Yeah, there's an interesting one here which we can pick up a bit later, Marion, which is about how we nudge virtually.
Yeah. We'll address that later.
Yeah. Multiple groups with overlapping responsibilities. Yeah, that's an organisational one there, Mike. Yeah. Misalignment of goals from Steve. Too many people being involved in decisions. Yeah, that's Danny. That's one that's we often hear about. Yeah. So there's a few there, Marion, of different ones.
Yeah, and the thing is with sludges as well is that they're also mindset sludges as well. So that's something to consider too when you're thinking about identifying sludges. So my practical top tips in order to develop an organisation that is resilient in adopting new behaviours and adapting to change. My first top tip is to break behaviours down into the habit loop, which is CAR. So identifying the cue, the action, so what exactly you want your employees to do, and the reward, what is the outcome, what do you want to achieve. Then start getting creative in designing your nudges. How do we go about nudging people to behaving a certain way or in the new way, ready for the context? Following the principles of FEAST, it being fun, easy, attractive, social, and timely. And then also considering the sludges and making sure you identify them and then removing them in order for you to adopt new behaviours in a really effective and sustainable way. I'll pass back to Gary. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mariam. So, yeah, what we've covered off around being organisational resilient, we've only covered some very specific issues. And of course, there are many that build organisational resilience, but we've covered off how to use a framework to reimagine your organisation and really build in that customer responsiveness so that you're adapting and responding to change. We've covered about the need for social cohesion and the rebuilding of social cohesion once you come out of lockdown. And we've looked at using the nudge theory in order to move people's behaviours to a new set of behaviours that you may need. So those are the areas that we've covered, but just wanted to check with you, do you have any questions about any of the areas that we've covered? So again, just if you could just put into chat any particular question.
Yeah, so Tali has a specific question, which was about the research I quoted about how easy it is to form in groups. The researcher is an Henri, and it's Tafel, and it's Tajfel. But we will be sending out these slides later, and I'll make sure that the reference is in there. So Louise has come in with a question, which is there is currently a real push for more agile organisations and agile ways of working. Do you have any top tips on this and how to encourage it in the context of organisational structures?
Well, I think what we're finding is agile techniques obviously started within technology, and now we're trying to move it into other parts of the organisation, into product and elsewhere. One of the biggest blockers, actually, Louise, is the leadership, and they need to have what we would call an agile mindset. So one of the tips would be to work on your leader's mindset to be accepting of what's required. Often it's more the historical way of leading can inhibit the introduction of agile techniques. You can bring in lots of agile techniques, but it'll be the leaders that will be effectively the sludge in this case.
And then there's a question from Danny, which I think is for you, Marion, which was really about that question about virtual nudging. How do you nudge people in the kind of virtual organisation?
Yeah, it is really important to consider that nudges will work differently if you're working remotely and then physically. So it is just important to consider that. And when you're designing those nudges, bear those motivations and that context in mind. I mean, it can be done. We do nudges through reminders, through emails, having something in the footer of your email to nudge people to respond in a way that's beneficial, in order to incorporate values, for example. So there are things that can be done, but like I said, it is important to consider the context when you are nudging people.
Okay, I think that's all the questions we've got. I'll just check. Yep, that's it.
Okay, so thank you all. We will be sending out a summary of the presentation, and we will be also having another coffee catch up to cover the area of leadership, which, to the point about agile mindset, definitely comes into that on the leadership aspects of organisational resilience. So that'll be happening, date to be confirmed. Meanwhile, we can run bespoke workshops on each of the areas we've covered, on the organisational, on the social, and on the behavioural. Please get in touch with us. But meanwhile, thanks for joining us, and look forward to having a coffee catch up with you again soon. So bye for now and have a great day.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.